Yeah. So I'm supposed to give you a worldwide view about the death penalty. So we're going to do three things. We're going to look at the use of death sentences, which are to be distinguished from the actual carrying out of the death penalty. And then I will say something about worldwide statistics relating to abolition or retention of the death penalty in different countries and some of the main reasons why some countries retain the death penalty. So most of the statistics in this presentation are actually from Amnesty International's 2016 report on the use of the death penalty. Amnesty has been collecting statistics and publishing them regularly for many years, and so I suppose you can regard them as quite reliable. Okay, so firstly on death sentences. According to Amnesty International, last year, there were 3,117 people sentenced to death in 55 countries last year. And this is actually a significant increase over the 2015 figure, where there were just under 2,000 people sentenced to death. So this is not actually having the death penalty carried out yet. And this actually exceeds the previous highest figure in 2014, which was 2,466 people. So this means that at the moment, 2016 is the highest number of people sentenced to death in, since their records started. Although Amnesty then goes on to explain that the increase is partly because they got better statistics. For example, Thailand, for the first time, gave them very detailed information about the number of people that were sentenced to death. And they said that they also were able to improve their data collection techniques. So part of it, I think, is not attributable to just that suddenly there was a big increase in the number of people sentenced, but just more data became available, so that's partly to do with that. And according to the records, at the end of 2016, at least 18,848 people are known to be under sentence of death somewhere in the world. So now the actual use, the carrying out of the death penalty. So from the statistics, at least 1,032 people are known to have been executed. This figure actually excludes executions in China. It is believed to be high in China, but data on the use of the death penalty is a state secret. And therefore, Amnesty, they used to report some kind of figures based on an estimate, but after a while they decided that it's they're not quite sure how many, so they would just not state it, but say that it is believed to be quite high. So all these figures do not include China, where it could be in the thousands. The total number of people executed, known to have been executed, is actually lower than in 2015. It's 30% lower, it's 40%, so it's almost 40% lower. And 2015 was a record year. It had a record number of people executed since 1989. 4 countries in the world accounted for 87% of the executions: Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. And Iran itself accounted for 55% of all executions in the world last year. As Wing Chong pointed out, in Singapore last year, 4 people were recorded as having been executed. It is also believed that more than 7 have had the death penalty imposed on them last year, and more than 38 are currently on death row. The methods used in the world for carrying out the death penalty are generally as follows: beheading, Saudi Arabia, only one country; hanging, quite a number of countries there, including Singapore; lethal injection, China, US, and Vietnam; and shooting. So according to the UN Human Rights Committee, in a case called Rolando against the Philippines in 2004, mandatory death sentences are inconsistent with human rights protections because they don't allow for the possibility of taking into account the defendant's personal circumstances or the circumstances of how the offense was carried out. However, mandatory death sentences are still imposed in the following countries: Barbados, Ghana, Iran, Jordan, Malaysia, Maldives, Myanmar, Nigeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and Trinidad and Tobago. Article 6, sub-article 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says partly, in countries which have not abolished the death penalty, sentence of death may only be imposed for the most serious crimes, in accordance with the law in force at that time of the commission of the crime. So according to Amnesty International's own interpretation of this provision, crimes that don't involve intentional killing, i.e. murder, do not meet this threshold of most serious crimes. And therefore, it does not regard drug-related offenses as falling into this category of most serious crimes. Nonetheless, the death penalty is still imposed for drug-related offenses in a number of countries, including Singapore. Singapore, I should note, is not a party to the international covenant. So I suppose it will say, well, we are not, strictly speaking, required to follow its requirements. Nonetheless, an argument can be made out that a lot of the principles in the ICCPR are now matters of customary international law, and so would be applicable to all countries. So now to look at the rate of abolition or retention of the death penalty in the world. So as of last year, more than 2/3 of all countries in the world have abolished the death penalty, either in law or in practice. So countries that were abolitionist for all crimes were 104, and that's 52.5%. So more than half countries have abolished the death penalty in law. 7 countries are abolitionists for what is known as ordinary crimes. That is, you will still have the death penalty for military offenses or exceptional offenses like treason and so on, and that's about 3.5% of the countries. And then about 30 countries, or 15%, are abolitionists in practice. So in law, the death penalty still remains on the statute book. However, no executions have been carried out for the past 10 years, and they are believed to have a policy of not actually carrying out the death penalty. So the people kind of may remain on death row, but the executions are not carried out. And so this adds up to a total of 141 countries, which is about 71.2%. The number of retentionist countries is 57, or 28.8%. So this is just looking at it in a graphical sense. The purple one on the left-hand side would be the retentionist countries, and the big blue one are the abolitionists in law. The red one, abolitionists for ordinary crimes, and the green one, abolitionists in practice. So nonetheless, it is notable that the situation in a country can change quite rapidly. So in 2016, the Philippines and Turkey both pledged to reintroduce the death penalty as a measure to tackle crimes and threats to national security. And it seems to be correlated to a strong leader, if I, in inverted commas, coming to power, who will say, oh, we need to be tough on crime, we need to do something to solve a particular situation in our country. And in fact, the Philippines has gone to the extent of introducing a bill in the House of Representatives to reintroduce the death penalty. And this is also interesting because both of these countries are actually party to treaties on the abolition of the death penalty. Singapore is not actually a party to any such treaty, but these countries actually signed treaties in the past that said, we pledge to abolish the death penalty, but they are taking steps to reintroduce this. The Maldives also took steps to resume executions after more than 60 years of not carrying them out. So in 2016, some countries also broadened the use of the death penalty. That means made it more widely applicable. Bangladesh made some offenses relating to mutiny punishable by death. India reintroduced the death penalty for hijacking if it results in death. And South Korea made the death penalty available for some terrorism-related offenses. So at the end of last year, the UN General Assembly adopted General Assembly Resolution 71/187, and this is its 6th resolution on a moratorium on the use of the death penalty. So at a regular basis, the General Assembly of the UN will invite countries to agree to use a moratorium on the death penalty and to slowly phase it out. And this resolution calls on all states to respect international standards that provide safeguards guaranteeing the protection of rights of those facing the death penalty, to comply with obligations on consular relations. So if a foreigner in your country is facing a death penalty offense, then they're supposed to allow for diplomats and so on to visit the person. And they are also supposed to progressively restrict the death penalty use, to establish a moratorium on carrying out the death penalty, and to make available relevant disaggregated data. So break down by gender, by nationality, not just a kind of very basic figure. So the votes in favor of the resolution were 117 countries, so almost 2/3 supported the resolution. 40 countries were against, including Singapore, so that's about 20%. And then there were a number of countries abstaining, and some countries didn't turn up. So Singapore's representative at the UN General Assembly said, there is no international consensus against capital punishment, making it a sovereign matter for states. The death penalty is not an issue of it's an issue of criminal justice, not of human rights, which I find quite surprising. But nonetheless, this is what our representative said. Then he said the focus of the draft have, over the years, shifted from being a moratorium to a push for abolishing the practice. And he felt that some countries cannot agree with it, and for that reason, Singapore voted against this resolution. So finally, I'm just going to say a few things about some of the reasons that are often given by countries for retaining the death penalty and some possible responses. So this is from a document released by Reprieve, which is an NGO, I think, in the UK that tries to campaign against the death penalty. So, and these are quite common, I think you'll often hear them, right? So the first is, the death penalty acts as a deterrent and is therefore a way of reducing crime. So they have pointed out that 88% of criminologists do not think it is a very effective deterrent. And according to the UN Development Program, the 5 countries with the highest homicide rates that don't use the death penalty actually have a lower murder rate than the 5 countries with the highest homicide rates that actually do. So it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you have the death penalty, it means that your crime rate will be lower. It doesn't quite correlate that way, exactly. Also, many people do not consider the possibility that they will be sentenced to death at the time when they commit a murder. The crime is often committed spur of the moment or under the influence of some kind of intoxicant, and therefore it's hard to say that knowing that there is a death penalty will necessarily cause people to think twice before committing a serious crime. And in fact, there seems to be some statistics showing that the death penalty may in fact increase crime by, number one, desensitizing people to the immorality of killing, and also legitimizing the idea that vengeance for something that has happened is acceptable. So people may feel that, well, if the government can kill wrongdoers, then I can also take my own justice. Another argument is, well, in any case, those who are executed are evil people, and therefore they deserve it. So in response to that, Reprieve says, you can consider the fact that people who commit serious crimes often do so because of past abuse, mental illness, or other negative life influences. And there is research which suggests that many murderers have the potential to be rehabilitated. I just pause here to note that a lot of this is targeted at murder because in a lot of countries, drug trafficking is already not a death penalty offense, so a lot of the studies relate only to intentional killing, which still attracts the death penalty. That's why you don't really see a lot of comments about drug offenses so far. And finally, another common argument in support of the death penalty internationally is that, well, only guilty people are executed. They deserve it because they've gone through a trial and they've been found guilty, and so it is fair to impose the punishment on them. However, there is evidence from the US that innocent people have been wrongly sentenced to death. So, for example, between 1973 and 2012, 140 people were originally sentenced to death and then were actually exonerated later on. It was found on appeal or on further application to the court that the evidence didn't hold up and that actually had been wrongly sentenced. So they were not actually executed at the end of the day. But it means that mistakes can be made during the trial process. And I think it is worth noting that in a number of countries, not necessarily referring to our country here, but in a number of countries, the fairness of the trials that lead to the death penalty being imposed is quite questionable. So there is evidence that accused persons have been tortured or subject to inhuman treatment to force so-called confessions, and then they are convicted on the basis of that confession. And if that is the kind of situation in which they are then sentenced to death, then it really does bring the whole issue of whether it is fair to impose the death penalty on them into question. So I'm sure we can answer some questions about this later on, but that's a worldwide view of the death penalty so far. Thank you.